There are moments in public life when the mask slips. Not dramatically. Not in some explosive scandal caught on camera. No, it slips quietly. In the details. In the contradictions. In the gap between what is carefully staged and what people actually feel when they walk away. Meghan Markle went to Australia with a mission. Not just a tour. A mission. And behind that mission was something that, when it finally leaked out, stopped people mid-sentence. Something that made journalists pause. Something that made one veteran royal commentator receive a message from a colleague that simply read, "Is this AI?" Because what had been planned for this trip, what had been quietly arranged, rehearsed, and executed behind closed doors, was something almost no one in modern celebrity history has ever had to do. She had undergone humility training, anti-diva training, formal, deliberate, pre-planned, not a quiet word from a friend, not casual advice from a publicist. A structured, intentional program designed to make one of the most recognizable women on the planet appear approachable. Let that sink in. And the real question, the question that keeps surfacing no matter how many flattering magazine spreads follow, is simple. Did it work? The answer is more complicated than anyone wants to admit. And it reveals something far deeper than one woman's image problem. To understand why this training existed at all, you have to go back further than Australia. You have to understand the weight of what Meghan Markle carried into that trip. Not luggage, not designer outfits, not even Harry beside her. She carried a reputation. And reputations, once fractured, do not heal easily. Since the moment she stepped back from royal duties, that seismic, unprecedented withdrawal that shook the institution of the British monarchy, the narrative around Meghan had calcified into something stubborn and damaging. Demanding, controlling, difficult. Those three words had followed her across continents, across years, across every interview, every Netflix documentary, every podcast episode, every carefully worded statement released to the press. She had tried to fight it directly. That didn't work. She had tried to ignore it. That didn't work either. She had tried to reframe it, positioning herself as misunderstood, as targeted, as the victim of a system designed to crush anyone who challenged it. And while that narrative had its believers, it had an equal and growing number of skeptics. People who watched the public persona and felt something didn't quite align. Something was performing rather than being. Something was calculated rather than genuine. And now, with Australia on the horizon, her team made a decision. If the organic approach wasn't landing, if the natural Meghan wasn't winning hearts, then perhaps a more deliberate Meghan needed to be built. Piece by piece, gesture by gesture, smile by smile. The details that leaked about what happened before that Australia trip are remarkable in their specificity. This wasn't a PR refresh. This wasn't a new stylist or a different communication strategy. According to sources close to the situation, Meghan was, in the words that would eventually become the headline nobody expected, put through anti-diva training. The goal was surgical. Eliminate every behavior, every gesture, every moment that could be interpreted as entitled, detached, or self-serving. Replace it with warmth, approachability, genuine engagement, or at least the appearance of it. Because here is where it gets complicated. And this is the part that people who followed this story closely cannot stop discussing. There is a fundamental problem with performing humility. If people sense the performance, if the training shows, it doesn't just fail to help. It actively makes things worse. Because now it's not just that you seem difficult. Now it's that you seem difficult and dishonest about it. And some people felt they were watching exactly that unfold point. One of the first signals that something had shifted came before the trip itself. Meghan appeared on a podcast alongside two young men with Down syndrome. On the surface, warm, inclusive, genuine. But something about it triggered an unusual reaction among people who follow her closely. One of those people, a royal commentator with years of experience watching public figures manage their image, sent the clip to colleagues. The response came back almost immediately. 3 words. Is this AI? That response tells you something important. Not about the young men involved. Not about the cause itself. But about how the moment landed. Not as natural, not as spontaneous, but as so perfectly calibrated, so precisely on brand, that even people who watch these things professionally couldn't tell whether they were watching a human being or a very sophisticated simulation of one. That is the razor's edge Meghan was walking. And she was about to walk it across an entire continent. The Australia trip was designed as a statement. Bondi Beach. A hospital visit. engagement with ordinary people. The images of a woman who had left the rigid constraints of royal life and was now free, warm, connected, real. That was the plan. And for brief moments, it almost worked. There were photographs that looked right, interactions that read well, headlines that didn't immediately go negative. But then came the detail nobody had planned for. Or rather, the detail that someone had planned for, just not the right person. While Meghan was visiting victims of a terror attack, while she was clutching the hands of people in hospital beds, something else was happening simultaneously. Her clothing was being merchandised. Links, prices, by buttons. The outfit she wore while holding the hand of a trauma survivor was available for purchase within hours. Everything the anti-diva training had tried to erase, every hint of self-promotion, every whiff of using a moment for personal brand elevation, came flooding back in a single devastating detail. And here is the cruelest irony. Meghan may have done the training. She may have genuinely tried. But nobody told the people running the merchandise operation to stand down. The left hand and the right hand were not talking to each other. And the result was the exact image her team had spent weeks trying to prevent. That in the days that followed, something predictable happened. People magazine published a glowing account of the Australia trip. Stunning success. Major milestone. Template for future international engagements. The language was enthusiastic, specific, carefully worded to land in the news cycle and push a particular narrative forward. And for people who watch how celebrity PR operates, the timing and tone of that piece raised an immediate question. Who called this in? Because there is a pattern visible to anyone who studies it, where a potentially damaging narrative is followed almost instantly by a counter-narrative delivered through a friendly outlet. The article said Australia was a triumph, that future trips were being planned, that this was the beginning of something. But when commentators began reaching out to actual Australians, people who had been there, who had seen the coverage, who had felt the ripple of this visit move through their cities, the feedback was notably different. Quiet, underwhelmed, polite, but not impressed. There was no groundswell, no organic enthusiasm, no social media moment that took off without being seeded. The visit happened. People watched. People moved on. And in the royal world, in the world of influence and soft power that Harry and Meghan are trying to build, that is perhaps the most damaging outcome of all. Not outrage, not protest, indifference. Now here is a thread that runs underneath all of this, quieter than the headlines, but arguably more significant. Harry. Because this is not simply Meghan's story. It is Harry's story too. And the two have become so intertwined that separating their individual trajectories is almost impossible. But certain observations keep emerging, consistent, from multiple directions. When Harry is at Invictus Games without Meghan, when he is surrounded by veterans, by injured servicemen and women, by the community he built that program to serve, something changes in him. People who have watched him in those moments describe a visible shift. He loosens. He laughs differently. He engages with a kind of ease and authenticity that reads as genuinely him. Then Meghan arrives, and observers describe a different Harry. Watchful, careful, orbiting her rather than the room. Now that observation, fair or unfair, accurate or exaggerated, has become one of the defining undercurrents of how the public perceives this couple. And it matters for Australia, because Australia was meant to be their joint moment, their proof of concept, their demonstration that the Sussex brand could translate onto a global stage without a palace behind it, without an institution supporting it, on pure personal magnetism alone. But if Harry's magnetism and Meghan's magnetism are pulling in different directions, if his works best in one setting and hers requires extensive preparation to function in any setting, then the joint venture becomes a much harder sell. There is a document that Tom Bauer references in his latest book on Harry and Meghan that crystallizes this tension with brutal precision. Research, commissioned research, paid for, compiled, delivered. And its conclusion was not subtle. Harry, the research found, was a less likable figure because of the woman he married. Securing donors, critical for any foundation, for any operation of scale, was becoming more difficult because of the association. Not just with Harry and Meghan. Specifically Meghan. Think about what it means for that research to exist. Someone inside that operation, someone close enough to commission serious research and present it formally, looked at the numbers and decided that the most important finding needed to be stated directly, regardless of how uncomfortable it was. You are a liability. She is making you more of one. That is not tabloid speculation. That is internal assessment. And when you hold that document next to the anti-diva training, next to the People magazine spin, next to the Australia trip that was celebrated publicly and met with indifference privately, a picture begins to form. Not of a couple confidently building a new chapter, but of a couple in a managed retreat, running harder and harder just to stay in place. There was a moment at the end of the Australia trip that people noticed. Not a speech, not a photograph, an exit. When it came time to leave, Meghan moved quickly, with intention, toward the door, toward the next flight, toward the next thing. She was seated, observers noted, very close to the emergency exit at one of the sporting events she attended. Now that detail could mean nothing. People sit where they sit. But in the context of a trip that was supposed to be triumphant, supposed to be the beginning of a new era, an early, eager exit does not read like someone who just experienced the success they were promised. It reads like someone who got through it, who survived it, who is relieved it's over. And the absence of what came next confirmed something important. After a genuinely successful international engagement, after a trip that truly captured hearts, that created momentum, that opened doors, you capitalize on it. You announce the next one. You build on the energy while it's warm. No announcement came. No next trip was confirmed. No statement about the global model moving forward. The People magazine article said one thing. The silence that followed said something else entirely. Now the story shifts to a different stage. One with more personal stakes for Harry. Invictus Games. The thing Harry built. The legacy that exists independent of his marriage, independent of the palace, independent of everything that came before and after. Wounded warriors. Injured veterans. Competition. Dignity. Recovery. It is, by most accounts, the most genuinely good thing Harry has done with his platform. And now questions are swirling around it. Personnel changes. Shifts in the organizational structure. Whispers about the direction and the finances, and who exactly is making decisions and why. This pattern of Harry trying to reshape organizations around the people who support him and remove those who don't, is something that has appeared before. At the palace, at Archewell, and now, observers suggest, possibly at Invictus. The question being asked, quietly, carefully, but with increasing persistence, is whether Meghan's potential involvement in Invictus events is helping the brand or complicating it. Harry says yes, she helps. But Harry, as one commentator noted, couldn't say anything else even if he wanted to. The real answer would come from the organization itself, from the veterans who show up, from the donors who write the checks. And that answer, if it exists, has not been made public. Yet, step back from the individual stories for a moment. The podcast, the anti-diva training, the hospital visit, and the merchandise links. The People magazine counter-narrative. The quiet Australian indifference. The internal donor research. The early exit. The Invictus question marks. These are not separate events. They are a pattern. And the pattern tells a story about what happens when a public figure's actual reputation diverges significantly from their intended reputation, and they attempt to close that gap through management rather than authenticity. It rarely works. Not because the management is incompetent. Sometimes it is very competent. But because audiences, especially modern audiences, raised on social media, trained to spot performance from 1,000 miles away, can feel the machinery. They may not be able to name what feels off, but they feel it. And once they feel it, no amount of training, anti-diva or otherwise, closes that gap. Because the thing they are training toward is trust. And trust cannot be trained. It can only be earned. Slowly. Consistently. Through actions that cost something, that require genuine sacrifice, genuine risk, genuine vulnerability, rather than actions that are carefully choreographed to look like those things. What does all of this mean for Harry and Meghan going forward? That question is being asked with growing urgency by people who have followed this story across years and continents. The Sussex operation, the brand, the foundation, the media deals, the speaking engagements, the carefully maintained public presence, requires fuel. That fuel is relevance. And relevance requires attention. Genuine, organic, self-sustaining attention. Not the attention generated by a new story every week. Not the attention that comes from controversy or spin or a well-placed People magazine article. The kind of attention that builds over time. That compounds. That turns an audience into supporters and supporters into a movement. That kind of attention has to be earned through moments that land naturally, through connections that don't require training manuals, through a public persona that people feel, not one that people are supposed to feel. And right now, based on the evidence available, based on what observers are saying, based on what Australians felt when the tour ended and the cameras moved on, that organic relevance is not building. It is by several measures contracting, which means the pressure on every future trip, every future appearance, every future headline increases. Because each one now carries the weight of proving that the last one wasn't the beginning of the end. And that is an exhausting way to operate. For anyone, one final thread. Because it would be incomplete to end this without acknowledging something important about Harry's position in all of this. Harry did not create this image problem. Not alone. Not intentionally. He left an institution that he found suffocating. He chose a woman he loved. He tried to build something new in a context, American celebrity culture, the wellness industry, the podcast and Netflix landscape, that was entirely foreign to everything he had been trained for. And he has found in that new landscape that the skills that made him effective as a working royal, the ability to connect with veterans, with servicemen and women, with people in crisis, translate imperfectly into the world of brand deals and streaming content. He is not naturally a content creator. He is, at his core, a soldier's son who is most himself when he is in service. And the tragedy, if it is a tragedy, is that the institution that gave him the context for that service is now behind a wall he cannot return through. What is left is Invictus, and whatever they build next. And the question of whether what they are building is built on something real, or whether it requires, like that Australia tour, an extraordinary amount of planning behind the scenes to make it appear that way. In the end, the story of the anti-diva training is not really about Meghan Markle. It's about something much more universal. It's about the distance between who we are and who we want to be seen as. It's about the moment when that distance becomes large enough that it requires professional intervention to manage. And it's about whether, once that distance has been publicly identified, discussed, and debated, it is ever possible to close it again. The Australia trip happened. The training happened. The merchandise links happened. The People magazine article happened. The silence afterward happened. And now, somewhere in a room in Montecito or London, or wherever the next chapter is being planned, decisions are being made. About the next trip. About the next appearance. About whether the template worked or needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. History suggests that reputations are not rebuilt in a single tour. They are rebuilt, if they are rebuilt at all, in the accumulated weight of 1,000 small, unmanaged, unscripted moments. Moments that nobody trained for. Moments that nobody planned. Moments that are simply, undeniably, unmistakably real. The question that remains, the one that Australia could not answer, that People magazine could not answer, that anti-diva training cannot answer, is whether any of those moments are coming, and whether they will arrive in time.